David Martinez woke up that Tuesday morning with a knot in his stomach. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as he thought about what today would bring. His younger brother Miguel was facing one of the biggest challenges of his life, and David knew he had to be there for him. The alarm clock showed 6:30 a.m., but David was already wide awake. He got dressed in his best clothes, a navy blue shirt and dark pants that he usually saved for important occasions. Today definitely counted as important. As he brushed his teeth, he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The worry lines around his eyes seemed deeper than usual, and his normally neat hair looked messy from all the restless nights he'd been having lately. Miguel had been working as a school bus driver for 3 years. It wasn't just a job for him. It was something he truly cared about. Every morning he would wake up early, check his bus, and make sure every child got to school safely. The kids loved him too. They would wave excitedly when they saw him coming, and parents trusted him completely with their most precious cargo. But one mistake had changed everything. One terrible decision on a Friday evening had put Miguel's entire future at risk. David still remembered getting the phone call at 11 p.m. Miguel's voice was shaking as he explained what had happened. He had gone out with some friends after a particularly stressful week at work. One drink had turned into 2, then 3. When it was time to go home, Miguel thought he was fine to drive. He wasn't. The police officer who pulled him over was professional but firm. Miguel's blood alcohol level was just above the legal limit. Not by much, but enough to get him arrested and charged with driving under the influence. The worst part wasn't the arrest itself. It was knowing that his job was now in danger. School districts have strict policies about drivers with DUI charges. Miguel could lose everything he had worked for. David grabbed his keys and headed to his car. The drive to the courthouse took about 20 minutes, but it felt much longer. He kept thinking about their family and how much this situation was affecting everyone. Their parents had raised them to be responsible, to make good choices, and to always think about consequences. Miguel's mistake felt like a failure for the whole family. The courthouse building looked intimidating as David approached it. It was one of those old, official-looking structures with tall columns and stone steps. People were walking in and out, some in business suits, others looking nervous and uncomfortable. David had never been inside a courtroom before, and he wasn't sure what to expect. Security at the entrance was tight. David had to put his phone, keys, and wallet in a plastic tray, then walk through a metal detector. The security guard was polite but serious, checking David's ID and asking why he was there. "I'm here to support my brother," David explained. "He has a hearing today." The guard nodded and gave him directions to the correct courtroom. The hallways inside the courthouse were long and echoed with footsteps. David could see lawyers in expensive suits talking quietly with their clients, families huddled together looking worried, and court officials walking purposefully from room to room. The whole atmosphere felt heavy and serious. This wasn't like the courtrooms he had seen on TV shows. This was real, and the consequences were real too. David found the right courtroom and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The room was bigger than he had expected, with rows of benches for people to sit in, just like church pews. At the front of the room was the judge's bench, raised up high so everyone had to look up at whoever was sitting there. To one side was a desk for the court reporter, and there were tables for lawyers and their clients. Miguel was already there, sitting at one of the tables next to a public defender. He looked nervous and kept adjusting his tie. When he saw David enter the room, his face showed a mixture of relief and embarrassment. David gave him a small nod and an encouraging smile, then found a seat in the gallery where family members and other observers could sit. The courtroom was filling up slowly. There were other people there for different cases, some looking confident, others appearing worried or scared. David noticed an elderly woman who kept dabbing her eyes with a tissue, probably there for a family member just like he was. A young man in the corner was fidgeting with his hands, clearly nervous about whatever was going to happen to him. At exactly 9 a.m., a court officer called out, "All rise." Everyone in the courtroom stood up as Judge Patricia Hawkins entered. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her black robe made her look official and intimidating. She had the kind of presence that made everyone in the room pay attention immediately. Judge Hawkins took her seat and looked around the courtroom with sharp, observant eyes. "Good morning," she said in a clear, authoritative voice. "We have several cases to hear today, and I expect everyone to conduct themselves appropriately. This is a court of law, and it will be treated with the respect it deserves." David felt his heart beating faster as the proceedings began. The judge started calling cases one by one, and each time people would approach the front of the courtroom to face whatever consequences awaited them. Some cases were quick, resolved in just a few minutes. Others took longer, with lawyers arguing back and forth about details that seemed important but confusing to David. As he waited for Miguel's case to be called, David found himself paying attention to the court reporter. She was a middle-aged woman who sat at a small machine, typing incredibly fast as everyone spoke. Her fingers moved in a rhythm that reminded David of something, but he couldn't quite place what it was at first. The sound of her typing was steady and constant, like a heartbeat or a machine running smoothly. Click, 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 pause, click, 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 click. There was something almost musical about it, a pattern that seemed familiar but distant, like a memory from long ago. Finally, David heard the words he had been waiting for. The people versus Miguel Martinez. His brother stood up with his lawyer and walked to the front of the courtroom. David leaned forward in his seat, his hands gripped tightly together. This was it. This was the moment that would determine his brother's future. The prosecutor, stern-looking man in a dark suit, began reading the charges against Miguel. His voice was formal and cold as he described the events of that Friday night. David watched Miguel's shoulders tense up as he listened to his mistake being described in legal language that made it sound even worse than it actually was. Judge Hawkins listened carefully, occasionally making notes on the papers in front of her. Her expression was serious and unreadable. David tried to guess what she was thinking, but her face gave nothing away. This was clearly a woman who had seen many cases like this before, and she wasn't going to be easily swayed by emotions or excuses. The whole situation felt surreal to David. Here was his little brother, the same person who used to build model airplanes with him on Sunday afternoons, standing in front of a judge who had the power to change his entire life. It didn't seem real, but the serious faces around the courtroom reminded David that this was very real indeed, and the next few minutes would determine everything. The prosecutor cleared his throat and began speaking in that official tone that lawyers use in courtrooms. His voice echoed slightly in the large room as he started explaining Miguel's case to Judge Hawkins. David tried to focus on what the man was saying, but his mind kept wandering to memories of his family. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the defendant was operating a motor vehicle with a blood alcohol content of .085, which is above the legal limit in this state." The word sounded so cold and technical. David knew they were talking about his brother, but the way the prosecutor spoke made Miguel sound like a stranger, like just another case number on a long list. As the prosecutor continued talking, David found himself watching the court reporter again. Her fingers moved across that strange machine with incredible speed and precision. Click, 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 pause, click, 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 click. The rhythm was hypnotic in a way. It reminded David of something from his childhood, but he still couldn't figure out what it was. The sound took him back to weekend afternoons at his grandmother's house. She had this old sewing machine that she had owned for probably 30 years. It was one of those heavy, reliable machines that could sew through thick fabric without any problems. David and Miguel used to spend hours at her house, especially during summer vacations when their parents were at work. Grandmother Rosa would sit at that sewing machine for hours working on quilts for the family or fixing torn clothes. The machine made this distinctive sound as she worked, a steady, rhythmic clicking that filled the whole house. Click, click, click. Pause as she adjusted the fabric, then click, 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 click again. It was the sound of productivity, of love, being sewn into every stitch. David smiled slightly as he remembered how his grandmother would let him and Miguel help her sometimes. She would give them small tasks like sorting buttons or holding pieces of fabric while she pinned them together. "Every stitch matters, mijos," she would say in her gentle voice. "One wrong stitch can unravel the whole quilt if you're not careful." The memory was so vivid that David could almost smell his grandmother's kitchen, with its mixture of coffee, fresh tortillas, and the faint scent of fabric softener that always seemed to hang in the air. She had passed away just last month, and the pain of losing her was still fresh. The funeral had been one of the hardest days of David's life. Miguel had been especially close to their grandmother. She had always had a soft spot for him. Maybe because he was the younger one, or maybe because he reminded her of their grandfather when he was young. Miguel would visit her every Sunday after work, bringing her groceries and spending hours just talking with her about life. When grandmother Rosa got sick, Miguel had taken time off work to help take care of her. He would drive her to doctor appointments, make sure she took her medicine, and keep her company during the long, difficult days. The stress of watching her health decline had been hard on everyone in the family, but especially on Miguel. David wondered if that stress had contributed to Miguel's mistake that Friday night. His brother had been working extra hours, dealing with difficult kids on the bus, and then spending his free time taking care of their grandmother. Maybe that's why he had gone out with his friends that night. Maybe he just needed a break from all the responsibility and sadness. The prosecutor's voice brought David back to the present moment. "This case involves serious public safety concerns," the man was saying. "The defendant holds a commercial driver's license and is responsible for transporting school children on a daily basis. His actions demonstrate a concerning disregard for the safety of others." David felt his stomach tighten as he listened. The prosecutor was making Miguel sound like a dangerous person who didn't care about children's safety, but David knew that wasn't true. Miguel loved those kids. He knew many of their names, remembered their birthdays, and always made sure they got to school safely. One mistake didn't erase 3 years of careful, responsible driving. "The state is particularly concerned about the potential for reckless endangerment," the prosecutor continued. "When someone with Mr. Martinez's responsibilities makes the choice to drink and drive, they're putting innocent lives at risk. Children depend on school bus drivers to make good decisions, and this defendant failed in that responsibility." The words reckless endangerment hit David like a punch to the stomach, but at the same time they triggered another memory of his grandmother. She used to say that exact phrase when she was teaching him and Miguel about being careful, not reckless. Endangerment exactly, but something very similar. "Be careful with those scissors, mijo," she would say when David was helping her cut fabric. "One wrong cut can ruin the whole piece. You have to think before you act, because some mistakes can't be fixed." She would always add, "Remember, one wrong stitch can unravel everything you've worked so hard to create." The connection between the prosecutor's words and his grandmother's wisdom struck David as oddly meaningful. Here was this serious legal proceeding, talking about how one wrong decision could destroy Miguel's career, and all David could think about was his grandmother's gentle voice explaining the same concept while she worked on her quilts. It wasn't that David found the situation funny, not at all. This was probably the most serious thing that had ever happened to their family, but there was something almost poetic about the connection between his grandmother's simple wisdom and the complex legal language being used in this courtroom. David thought about all the quilts his grandmother had made over the years. Each one represented months of careful work, planning, and attention to detail. She would choose the colors carefully, cut each piece precisely, and sew everything together with patience and love. But she was always aware that one careless moment could ruin the whole project. Miguel's situation was like that too, in a way. He had spent 3 years building a good reputation as a school bus driver. Parents trusted him, children liked him, and his supervisors had always given him positive reviews. But one wrong decision on one Friday night had put all of that in danger. The court reporter's typing continued its steady rhythm, and David found himself thinking about how his grandmother would have handled this situation. She had always believed in second chances, in the possibility of fixing mistakes if you were willing to work hard and learn from what went wrong. "Every quilt tells a story," she used to say. "Some have perfect stitches throughout, but the most beautiful ones are the ones where you can see that the person making it learned something along the way. A small mistake, if you fix it properly, can actually make the whole quilt stronger." David wished his grandmother was still alive to give Miguel advice about how to handle this situation. She would have known exactly what to say to help him feel better. She had a way of making even the worst problems seem manageable, like they were just temporary setbacks that could be overcome with patience and effort. The prosecutor was still talking, using phrases like public safety and accountability and consequences for poor judgment. David understood that the man was just doing his job, but he wished there was a way to help him understand who Miguel really was as a person, not just as a defendant in a legal case. As these thoughts swirled through David's mind, mixing memories of his grandmother with worry about his brother's future, something unexpected happened. The combination of the court reporter's rhythmic typing, the prosecutor's serious words about reckless endangerment, and the vivid memory of his grandmother teaching them about careful stitching created a moment of strange clarity in David's mind. For just a split second, the whole situation seemed to make sense in a way that was both sad and somehow beautiful. His grandmother's wisdom about quilting applied perfectly to life itself. Miguel had made one wrong stitch, and now he was facing the possibility of having his whole life's work unraveled because of it. The thought brought a brief, bittersweet smile to David's face, followed by a quiet chuckle that escaped before he could stop it. The moment that small chuckle escaped David's lips, everything in the courtroom changed. It was as if someone had pressed a pause button on the entire world. The prosecutor stopped talking mid-sentence. The court reporter's fingers froze above her machine. Even the air in the room seemed to go completely still. Judge Hawkins's head turned slowly toward the gallery where David was sitting. Her eyes were like searchlights, scanning each face in the crowd with the precision of someone who had spent years reading people's expressions and intentions. David felt his heart drop into his stomach as he realized what had just happened. The small sound that had seemed so quiet in his own head had apparently been loud enough for everyone to hear. "Excuse me," Judge Hawkins said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife through paper. She wasn't shouting, but somehow her quiet tone was more intimidating than if she had been yelling. "Did I just hear someone laugh during these proceedings?" David's face immediately turned red. He could feel the heat spreading from his cheeks down to his neck. Every person in the courtroom seemed to be looking at him now, and he wished he could disappear into the wooden bench beneath him. His hands started shaking slightly, and he gripped them together to try to stop the trembling. Miguel turned around from his seat at the defendant's table, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. His face showed a mixture of embarrassment and fear. This was supposed to be his day in court, his chance to face the consequences of his actions with dignity, and now his older brother had somehow made everything worse. The public defender sitting next to Miguel looked concerned. She had probably seen family members react inappropriately before, but usually it was crying or angry outbursts, not laughter during serious legal proceedings. She whispered something quickly to Miguel, probably telling him to stay calm and not react to whatever was happening behind him. Judge Hawkins continued to stare at David, waiting for an answer. When no one responded immediately, her expression grew even more stern. "I asked a question," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. "Someone in this courtroom found something amusing about drunk driving charges. I want to know who it was." David knew he had to respond, but his throat felt dry and his voice didn't want to work. He tried to swallow, but his mouth felt like it was full of cotton. Finally, he managed to raise his hand slightly, like a student in school who knew he was about to get in trouble for something he had done. "It was me, Your Honor," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. He could hear how small and weak he sounded, which made him feel even worse about the whole situation. Judge Hawkins focused her full attention on David, and he felt like he was under a microscope. Her eyes seemed to look right through him, trying to figure out what kind of person would laugh during a drunk driving hearing. "Stand up," she commanded. David's legs felt shaky as he got to his feet. Everyone in the courtroom was staring at him now, and he had never felt more exposed or embarrassed in his entire life. He could see the confusion on Miguel's face, the disapproval on the prosecutor's face, and the curious expressions of the other people waiting for their own cases to be heard. "Sir," Judge Hawkins began, her voice growing harder with each word, "do you find drunk driving charges amusing?" Do you think it's funny when someone puts innocent people's lives at risk by getting behind the wheel of a car while intoxicated? David's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. How could he possibly explain what had really happened? How could he tell this intimidating judge that he had been thinking about his deceased grandmother's sewing machine? It would sound crazy, disrespectful, or both. Judge Hawkins wasn't finished. Perhaps you think it's entertaining when school bus drivers make poor decisions that could endanger the children they're supposed to protect. Maybe you find it hilarious that your brother might lose his job and his ability to support himself. Each question hit David like a physical blow. The judge was making him sound like a terrible person who didn't care about his family or public safety. But that wasn't true at all. David cared deeply about Miguel and was worried sick about what might happen to him. The last thing he would ever do was make fun of his brother's situation. "Your Honor, David started to say, but Judge Hawkins held up her hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," she said sharply. "In my 22 years on this bench, I have seen a lot of inappropriate behavior from family members and friends of defendants. I've seen people cry. I've seen people get angry. I've seen people try to argue with the court about their loved one's innocence. But I have never, in all my years as a judge, seen someone laugh during drunk driving proceedings." The courtroom remained completely silent except for the judge's voice. David could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He felt like he might be sick to his stomach. This was turning into a nightmare that kept getting worse with every passing second. Judge Hawkins leaned forward slightly, her expression growing even more severe. "Do you have any idea how serious drunk driving is? Do you understand that people die because of decisions like the one your brother made? Families are destroyed. Children lose their parents, and innocent people suffer because someone thought they were fine to drive when they weren't." David wanted to tell her that he understood all of that he had been worried about exactly those things since the night Miguel was arrested. But every time he tried to speak, the judge's intense stare made his words disappear before they could reach his mouth. "And here you sit," Judge Hawkins continued, "in my courtroom during official legal proceedings, laughing like this is some kind of entertainment for your amusement. What exactly do you think is so funny about someone potentially losing their career, their reputation, and their freedom?" The prosecutor watched the exchange with obvious approval. He had been trying to convince the judge that this case should be taken seriously, and David's inappropriate laughter seemed to support his argument that the Martinez family didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Other people in the courtroom started whispering quietly to each other. David could hear the disapproving murmurs and could imagine what they were thinking about him. They probably assumed he was some kind of troublemaker who didn't respect the law or the court system. Miguel looked like he wanted to disappear completely. His shoulders were hunched forward and he was staring down at his hands. David realized that his moment of inappropriate emotion wasn't just embarrassing for himself. It was making things harder for Miguel, too. The judge might be more likely to give Miguel a harsh sentence if she thought his family didn't take the charges seriously. Judge Hawkins sat back in her chair, but her expression remained stern and disapproving. "I have half a mind to hold you in contempt of court right now," she said, her voice carrying the weight of real threat. "Contempt of court is a serious charge that can result in immediate jail time. How would you like to spend the next few days in a cell thinking about what's so amusing about drunk driving?" David's eyes widened in shock. He had never imagined that his small chuckle could lead to him being arrested and put in jail. The thought of being locked up, of having to call his work to explain why he wouldn't be coming in, of having to tell his parents that he had been arrested in court was terrifying. "Maybe a night or two in jail would help you understand that this courtroom is not a place for entertainment," Judge Hawkins continued. "Maybe sitting in a cell would give you time to think about why drunk driving isn't a laughing matter. What do you think about that idea?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. David realized that his entire life could change in the next few minutes, all because of one moment when his emotions had overwhelmed his common sense. David stood there in the courtroom, feeling like the weight of the entire world was pressing down on his shoulders. Judge Hawkins was waiting for an answer, and everyone else in the room was staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to complete disapproval. His hands were shaking so badly now that he had to clasp them together to try to keep them still. For a moment, David considered just apologizing and sitting back down. Maybe if he said he was sorry quickly enough, the judge would let it go, and they could move on with Miguel's case. But something in Judge Hawkins' eyes told him that a simple apology wasn't going to be enough. She wanted a real explanation, and she wasn't going to accept anything less than the complete truth. Taking a deep breath, David tried to find his voice. His throat felt dry and scratchy, but he knew he had to speak up. Not just for himself, but for Miguel too. His brother's future might depend on how well David could explain what had just happened. "Your Honor," David began, his voice still shaky, but growing a little stronger with each word. "I want to apologize first. I know that what I did was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry for disrupting your courtroom. I have nothing but respect for this court and for the law." Judge Hawkins didn't say anything, but she leaned back in her chair slightly, indicating that she was willing to listen. David took this as a sign to continue, even though his heart was still beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. "I wasn't laughing at my brother's charges," David continued, looking directly at the judge even though it made him feel uncomfortable. "I would never make fun of drunk driving or treat it like it's not serious. My brother's situation is one of the most serious things our family has ever faced." He paused for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. How could he explain about his grandmother and the sewing machine without sounding completely crazy? How could he make the judge understand that his chuckle had come from grief and memory, not from amusement at the legal proceedings? "The reason I made that sound, Your Honor, was because something reminded me of my grandmother who passed away just last month. I know that might sound strange, but please let me explain." David glanced over at Miguel, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and worry in his eyes. Miguel had been just as close to their grandmother as David was, and he would understand exactly what David was talking about. "While the prosecutor was speaking, I was listening to the court reporter typing," David continued, gesturing toward the woman with the typing machine. "The sound of her machine reminded me of my grandmother's old sewing machine. She used to make quilts for our family, and I spent many hours listening to that same rhythm when I was growing up." Judge Hawkins's expression didn't change, but David thought he saw something soften slightly in her eyes. Maybe she had had a grandmother too. Maybe she understood what it was like to lose someone who had been important to your whole family. "My grandmother raised me and Miguel after our parents had to work 2 jobs to support us," David explained, his voice becoming more steady as he talked about someone he had loved so much. "She was the one who taught us right from wrong. She was the one who made sure we did our homework, who cooked our meals, and who was always there when we needed advice or comfort." The courtroom remained silent, but David could sense that people were actually listening now instead of just judging him. Even the prosecutor seemed to be paying attention, though his expression remained neutral. When the prosecutor mentioned reckless endangerment, it reminded me of something my grandmother used to say when she was teaching us to be careful. She would always tell us that one wrong decision could unravel everything we had worked for, just like one wrong stitch could ruin a whole quilt. David's voice caught slightly as he talked about his grandmother's wisdom. Even a month after her death, it was still hard to talk about her without getting emotional. She used to say, "Be careful, mijos, because some mistakes can't be fixed easily. One wrong stitch can unravel the whole quilt." When I heard those words, reckless endangerment, in this courtroom, talking about my brother's situation, I couldn't help thinking about how perfectly my grandmother's advice applied to what Miguel is going through right now. Judge Hawkins was listening intently now, her expression more thoughtful than angry. David could see that she was trying to understand the connection he was making between his grandmother's quilting lessons and the legal proceedings. "It wasn't that I found anything funny about drunk driving or about Miguel's charges," David continued, his voice growing stronger with emotion. "It was just that for a split second, I could hear my grandmother's voice so clearly, and the way her simple wisdom applied to this complicated legal situation struck me as, I don't know how to explain it exactly. It was sad and meaningful at the same time." David wiped his eyes, realizing that tears had started forming as he talked about his grandmother. He hadn't expected to get so emotional, but talking about her in this setting, connecting her memory to Miguel's current crisis, brought back all the grief he had been trying to keep under control. "Miguel was her favorite grandson," David said, looking over at his brother who now had tears in his own eyes. She loved him so much and he loved her back just as much. When she got sick, Miguel spent every free moment he had taking care of her. He would drive her to doctor appointments, bring her groceries, and just sit with her when she was feeling bad. The prosecutor's expression had changed too. He was still professional, but there was something more human in his face now, as if he was seeing Miguel not just as a defendant, but as a real person with a real family who cared about him. The stress of watching our grandmother get sicker and sicker was really hard on Miguel, David continued. He was working full-time, trying to be the best school bus driver he could be, and then spending all his free time taking care of the person who had taken care of us when we were kids. I think that stress contributed to his poor decision that Friday night. David turned to face Judge Hawkins directly, making sure she could see the sincerity in his eyes. Your Honor, I know that stress doesn't excuse what Miguel did. There's no excuse for drinking and driving ever. But I want you to understand that Miguel isn't a bad person who doesn't care about other people's safety. He's someone who has spent his whole life trying to take care of the people he loves. The courtroom was completely quiet now. Even the people waiting for their own cases seemed to be absorbed in David's explanation. He could see that his words were having an impact, though he wasn't sure yet whether that impact would be positive or negative. When I heard the prosecutor talking about how Miguel's mistake could unravel his whole career, all I could think about was my grandmother saying that one wrong stitch could unravel a whole quilt, David said, his voice full of emotion. For just a moment, it felt like she was there in the courtroom with us, reminding us that everyone makes mistakes, but that doesn't mean they can't learn from them and do better. David took a shaky breath before continuing with the most important part of his explanation. The small sound I made wasn't laughter at Miguel's situation, Your Honor. It was more like recognition. Recognition that my grandmother's simple wisdom about quilting was exactly what Miguel needed to hear right now. That one mistake doesn't have to define who you are or destroy everything you've built, if you're willing to face the consequences and work to make things right. After David finished speaking, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that you could have heard a pin drop. It was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the tense, uncomfortable silence that had followed his inappropriate chuckle, but something deeper and more thoughtful. Even the usual background sounds of the courthouse seemed to fade away as everyone processed what they had just heard. Judge Hawkins sat back in her chair, studying David's face carefully. Her expression had changed completely from the stern, angry look she had worn just minutes earlier. Now she looked more like a person than a judge, someone who understood loss and grief and the complicated ways that emotions could surface at unexpected moments. David remained standing, unsure whether he should sit down or wait for the judge to tell him what to do. His hands had stopped shaking, but his heart was still beating fast. He had said everything he could think of to explain himself. Now all he could do was hope that Judge Hawkins would understand and forgive his moment of inappropriate emotion. Miguel was crying quietly at the defendant's table. Tears were streaming down his face as he thought about their grandmother and everything David had just shared with the courtroom. The public defender sitting next to him handed him a tissue, her own eyes looking slightly watery. Even she seemed moved by David's explanation. Judge Hawkins finally spoke, her voice much softer than it had been before. Mr. Martinez, she said, addressing David directly. Thank you for that explanation. I can see that you were not making light of your brother's situation or showing disrespect to this court. David felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he could tell that Judge Hawkins wasn't finished speaking yet. He continued to stand and wait, hoping that the worst part of this ordeal was over. Grief is a complicated emotion, Judge Hawkins continued, looking not just at David but at Miguel as well. It can appear at the most unexpected times and in the most unexpected ways. I lost my own grandmother 15 years ago, and I still sometimes hear her voice or think of her advice when I'm facing difficult situations. The judge paused for a moment, seeming to gather her thoughts. However, I want to be very clear about something. While I understand and accept your explanation for what happened, this courtroom must maintain its dignity and respect. Regardless of what emotions you might be feeling, it's important to remember where you are and what we're dealing with here. David nodded quickly, understanding exactly what she meant. Yes, Your Honor. I completely understand, and I promise it won't happen. Again, I have nothing but respect for your courtroom and for the legal process. Judge Hawkins studied him for another moment, then nodded. I believe you do. You may sit down now. As David sank back into his seat, he felt like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had managed to explain himself without making things worse for Miguel, and Judge Hawkins seemed to accept that his reaction had been innocent rather than disrespectful. But now the focus returned to Miguel's case, and David realized that the real challenge was just beginning. Judge Hawkins turned her attention back to Miguel, who was still emotional but trying to compose himself for whatever was about to happen next. Mr. Miguel Martinez, Judge Hawkins said, her voice returning to its official tone but somehow warmer than it had been before. Please stand. Miguel got to his feet, wiping his eyes with the tissue his lawyer had given him. He looked nervous but more hopeful than he had at the beginning of the hearing. David's explanation seemed to have changed the atmosphere in the courtroom in a way that might benefit Miguel's case. I've been listening to the prosecutor's presentation of the facts in your case, Judge Hawkins began. There's no question that you made a serious error in judgment on the night you were arrested. Driving under the influence is never acceptable, and it's especially concerning when it involves someone who holds a commercial driver's license and is responsible for the safety of school children. Miguel nodded, his expression serious and remorseful. Yes, Your Honor, I understand that, and I take full responsibility for my actions. Judge Hawkins continued. However, I've also been thinking about what your brother just shared with us about your family situation and the stress you were under at the time. While stress doesn't excuse poor decisions, it does help me understand the context in which those decisions were made. David held his breath, hoping that the judge was leading up to something positive for Miguel. The prosecutor looked less confident than he had earlier, as if he sensed that the mood in the courtroom had shifted in a direction he hadn't expected. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman, Judge Hawkins said, surprising everyone by addressing the personal aspects of David's explanation. Her advice about how one wrong stitch can unravel a whole quilt is actually quite applicable to this situation. You've spent 3 years building a good reputation as a school bus driver, but one night of poor judgment has put all of that at risk. Miguel's voice was shaky when he responded. She was the wisest person I've ever known, Your Honor. I know she would be disappointed in me for the choice I made that night, but I also know she would want me to learn from it and do better. Judge Hawkins nodded thoughtfully. I believe that's true, and I think she would also want you to have the opportunity to prove that you can learn from this mistake and continue to be the responsible person you were before that night. The courtroom remained silent as everyone waited to hear what the judge would decide. David could see hope starting to appear on Miguel's face, though he was clearly trying not to get too optimistic before hearing the final verdict. After considering all the factors in this case, Judge Hawkins announced, including your previous clean driving record, your positive employment history, and the personal circumstances that contributed to your poor judgment, I'm going to offer you an alternative to the standard penalties for this offense. David felt his heart skip a beat. This sounded like good news, but he didn't want to celebrate until he heard the details. Instead of the automatic license suspension and possible jail time that typically accompanies a DUI conviction for someone with a commercial license, Judge Hawkins continued, I'm going to sentence you to 6 months of community service, mandatory, alcohol education classes, and regular check-ins with a probation officer. Miguel's face showed a mixture of relief and gratitude, but Judge Hawkins wasn't finished yet. However, she added, her voice becoming more serious again, this is contingent on several conditions. First, you will not drive any vehicle, personal or commercial, for the next 90 days. Second, you will complete 200 hours of community service, specifically working with organizations that educate people about the dangers of drunk driving. Third, you will attend weekly alcohol education classes for 6 months. Miguel nodded eagerly. Yes, Your Honor. I'll do all of those things. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Judge Hawkins held up her hand to indicate she still had more to say. Most importantly, if you complete all of these requirements successfully and stay out of any further legal trouble, I will allow you to petition for the restoration of your commercial driver's license after 6 months. This means you could potentially return to your job as a school bus driver. The relief on Miguel's face was overwhelming. David could see tears of gratitude in his brother's eyes as the reality of the judge's decision sank in. This wasn't just a second chance. It was a path back to the life and career that Miguel had worked so hard to build. "Your grandmother was right," Judge Hawkins said, looking directly at Miguel. "One wrong stitch doesn't have to unravel the whole quilt, as long as you're willing to do the work to repair the damage and strengthen the fabric. I'm giving you the opportunity to prove that you can mend this mistake and become an even better person because of what you've learned from it." As the hearing concluded and Miguel thanked the judge repeatedly, David realized that his grandmother's wisdom had somehow found its way into the courtroom and influenced the outcome in a way none of them could have expected. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the people who love us most, even after they're no longer with us to share them in person.